I'm Rick Reynolds with Ask Forensics. Our rich database profiling $22 billion worth of sales pursuits and account health has been used by professors at several business schools for publishing and research. I've always been fascinated by the insights they glean through their academic lens. In particular, their ability to identify nuanced perceptions using their academic level analytics tools. In this video, I interview Scott Friend. He teaches at Miami University and has used our data for many years.
One of the first projects that we did together was really focused on that latter part, why sales are lost. So not looking at kind of both sides of the outcomes, but really specifically looking at a subset of analyses and data that you all had collected around failed sales opportunities. Now, these could have been incumbents that failed. These could have been outside supplier organizations that failed to acquire a new account. But across multiple cases, and in Rick's team, they're collecting multiple interviews within each individual case. We're looking at a lot of data in qualitative format, interviews with these decision makers of why the sales organization lost. And when we looked at that across a number of cases, and one of these first projects was very general in our kind of analysis, we found three big themes that kept emerging over and over and over from the data. And those three big themes were a lack of an adaptive sales approach, a lack of a relational sales approach, and then some sort of excessive cost considerations. So I think probably the first two are the ones that we would focus on in this video. And where we find value in this is really digging into the nuances. I think some of those themes themselves are fairly intuitive, but when you look at it from the customer's perspective and how they're defining a lack of an adaptive approach and how they're defining a lack of a relational approach, it's really unique. And then also just verifying some of those intuitions that we have is really important as well.
What would be some key nuggets from your research that would be totally relevant in the corporate world?
Well, I think that's a great way to ask the question, right? Because you're saying, how could sales organizations sell more effectively? And the first thing that you're doing is saying, all right, let's not just look at the performance side. Let's not just look at the wins, but there's a whole separate area where we can get to that same outcome through kind of a separate set of variables by looking at failure. Because the first thing that we learned is that failure is not the inverse of performance. It's not just that when you do this, you win, and when you don't do this, you lose. There's a complete separate subset of variables that drive failure versus those that drive performance. There are some that overlap as well, but even those are weighted differently between how they drive performance and how they drive failure. So let's look at this just from a failure perspective and say everything we're learning here can help reduce failure, which by default helps us get us to better outcomes. In this case, the first one was around a lack of an adaptive approach. And so again, this is a common sales methodology with the organizational learning is how to be adaptive and all the sales strategies that come along with that. But what's this look like from the customer's perspective? What does a lack of adaptive ability in this particular case look like? A lot of things that we're seeing revolve around both a motivation and an ability. So the motivation being a lack of listening. So salespeople are taught to ask questions, but the listening side is what the customer is seeing. And then a lack of ability. So the solutions or the capabilities to be adaptive aren't there. And that can be an organizational issue beyond just the salesperson.
Scott, you're actually touching on two interesting points. One seems to reflect the sales interaction itself, that the sales team is not listening, therefore they're not customizing the proposal to meet the specific needs of that prospect. And the other seems to reflect the capabilities of the organization.
Kind of lead the customer to that point. And so they have very directed questions. They're not really listening that much to the response. But buyers are picking up on that in this data. We're seeing it. We're seeing the customer voice really clearly say the salesperson was arrogant. They were unresponsive to our needs. And they are really picking up on some of these key elements that the salesperson is maybe thinking aren't quite visible in this process, but it's making a big difference because again, all these were failed sales opportunities. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars lost in sales revenue here. And it sometimes comes down to some of those human elements.
Thank you for watching our video, and I hope you gleaned several insights to apply to your business. Stay tuned for upcoming segments of my interview with Scott Friend at Miami University.